Hey friends, welcome to the Wisdom Download podcast. This is Tommy Stewart, and today we're joined by Chris Clarke all the way from New Zealand. Good morning or good evening, Chris.
Hello, Tommy. Kia ora. It's so good to be speaking to you today.
We're wonderfully overjoyed to have you, Chris, with us, and your sunny face from probably a much warmer New Zealand than what we have in the Northern Hemisphere right now.
Well, it is warmer, Tommy, but we're also still in lockdown. So this is sort of day 77 of the lockdown for Auckland people where I live. And I've realized that I'm still probably about 20 or 30 days away from getting a haircut. So what you can see is a very woolly version of a Kiwi. But I'm joined by about 2 million other Kiwis who are also missing haircuts and go have a coffee and all those kind of things.
Chris, I have to say I had my hair cut yesterday afternoon and I had a coffee. So, not to make you jealous, but there we are. Chris, we've been a delight to get to know you over recent times through a couple of different organizations and ministries. But perhaps you could tell us a little bit about your background. Who is Chris Clarke?
Well, I should really ask my wife. She'd give you a much crisper understanding. But I was born in New Zealand and educated in New Zealand. But we've lived in a number of places around the world, including a fabulous sojourn in Wales, in the UK, and in England, and a subsequent trip. And then we lived in Denmark for a while as well. But grew up in rural New Zealand and grew up in a Christian family. So I've never not known Christ in one sense. But I vividly recall we were living in Christchurch in the South Island, and I was walking home from school. I was an 8-year-old, and I'd been very inspired by the story of David Livingstone. Somehow or other, I'd read that story, and I liked the idea of Livingstone the adventurer. And anyway, God spoke to me in a remarkably dramatic way. And I remember the time, I can tell you where it was. I was outside the local bookstore and just walking home, dragging my school bag with me. And God spoke to me and he said, Chris, I'm going to use you to help change my world. And I remember both being slightly startled, but at the same time sort of thinking, well, why is it taking you 8 years to tell me, Lord? It's been a wee while. And but it is true to say it totally changed my life. But it also led to a interesting encounter with my mother, because you're asking a question about, where do I come from? Because I got home and Mum was at home, and first question she asked was, how did your school day go? And 8-year-old boys are certainly not self-reflective. It's not part of the gene pool. I said, oh yeah, it was fine. And Mum said, oh, what happened? Oh, nothing much. And she said, oh, surely something happened, Chris. And I said, oh yeah, Mum, God spoke to me. Now, my mother was used to dealing with devout young boys, and she said, oh, that's lovely, dear. What did he say to you? And I said, oh, well, he said to me that he's going to use me to help change his world.
Yes.
And Mum's response to that is priceless. She turned around and said to me, darling, that's absolutely lovely. Perhaps you could start by tidying your bedroom. And I remember sitting thinking, Mum, you don't get it. You don't get it. But actually, in some ways, never has a wiser word been said to a young man who kind of wanted to serve the Lord. So anyway, yes. That was when I was 8. I know your connections for Youth for Christ. And although I grew up in a Christian context and have never not known Christ, I went to my first ever Youth for Christ rally in Christchurch. Wow. Admittedly, more interested in the girls than actually in Christianity,
quite
nonetheless.
Common thing,
but I turned up there. Well, it worked. The gospel was preached, and I went up to the front as a 14-year-old boy, and it is fair to say that my whole life changed from that point on. So I have a deep affection for Youth for Christ. It gave me a bit of a problem, though, and the problem was that as a young teenager, really committed to serving the Lord, but trying to figure out how on earth could I do that and what would that look like for the rest of my life. Well, as it's turned out, it's been a delightful life thus far. So I married Karen, my wife. We've been married 33 years. And in fact, she literally fell into my arms, which is how we met, which is a very exciting way to meet a young woman. She was in a lift at a university that I was going to, and the lift came up to the 4th floor where I was standing at the law school, about to step into the lift. And she stepped out with a whole pile of books, but the lift hadn't quite landed correctly on the landing. And so she walked out, she tripped literally into my arms.
Wow.
And that's how I met my wife, who's also Christian. she took some convincing that she wanted to marry me, but we were married. We've been married the last 33 years. And we've got two children, two adult children, two boys. Zachary, who's down in Wellington,
Mm-hmm.
working for the government, and then Oscar, our youngest, who's an architect here in Auckland.
Wow. What a story. For your wife to fall into your arms. Your future wife to fall into your arms.
Yes, she was quite a catch, actually, Tommy. I'd noticed her around the university quite a few times, but she'd never noticed me. So I think in God's providence, this was about the only way she was going to notice me, by literally falling into my arms. So it worked very well for me.
And for those who are watching this podcast, Chris, who have a Youth for Christ connection, I believe your wife's family had a Youth for Christ connection.
Yes, indeed. So my father-in-law, who's just passed away in the last 3 weeks, he helped found Youth for Christ in New Zealand. He was particularly focused on the South Island, but he served on the national board of Youth for Christ for many, many, many years. So Youth for Christ was a big part of my wife's family and of my own experience. So only deep affection for the ministry of Youth for Christ here in New Zealand and, of course, internationally.
Wow, just amazing that link. I only discovered that link when sadly your father-in-law passed away recently. So you described an early experience in life of an encounter with Jesus at the age of 8, hearing God speak, a recommitment or a commitment of your life to Christ at 14. And then life has gone on and the years have gone by. You've been to university, you've went into work, business, ministry, you've been married 33 years. So what role has faith played across that time in your life, your work, your family, your leadership?
It's been absolutely foundational. In fact, I can't imagine how I could have lived life other than a life of faith. But to give some meaning to that, my name is Christopher, and Christopher means bearer of Christ. And there's a real significance, I think, in the names that we're given. And so for me, it's been about trying to be a bearer of Christ in whatever situation I've been in, whether we're talking about an academic situation or I spent 22 years working in the health sector around the world, then in the humanitarian world with World Vision, and then more recently in the leadership space. So for me, it's been foundational in the sense of it's given me the deep purpose, which is to be a bearer of Christ kind of wherever I'm placed.
Yes.
Is a delightful definition of discipleship, which I heard as a young man and actually has really guided me, which is that our call is wherever, whenever, whatever, and whoever God calls us to. And it's an extraordinary abandon, really, of ourselves to the Lord, in the sense of saying, Lord, wherever you call me, whenever, to whatever, and to whoever. So it's been foundational in the sense of giving me that deep, deep purpose. But it's also been foundational in the sense of it's helped give me a framework for understanding the world.
Yes.
I mean, as you know, we all have a worldview, irrespective of our religious tradition or seemingly of a religious tradition. Is that what it's given me is a way of understanding the world, my place in the world, the meta story, the big story of the world, and thus my chapter, that very, very small part in that story. So for me, that's been absolutely fundamental. And then thirdly, for me, the journey of any person, whether they're a Christian or not, often involves moments of self-doubt and hesitancy and moments of deep questioning, both of your own giftings and abilities and regret and remorse and all those kind of things. What Christianity has given me is a deep understanding that I have standing. I have gravitas in the Lord, in that I am much loved, that I was always desired by him, and that in this extraordinary providential way, he has a purpose for my life. So even though at the moment I might feel somewhat distant from that purpose or wondering what am I doing here on this part of the world, that actually it's all fitting into God's much bigger picture. So for me, it's been both about a bearing, that I'm the bearer of Christ. It's been about a framework to understand the world and my place in the world, and deeply a sense of my own preciousness in the sight of God.
Some questions for you, Chris, that are not maybe on the script, but firstly, you mentioned World Vision. Tell us a little bit about what your role was in World Vision.
Look, this was God's providence. So maybe a moment of background, actually, Tommy, if you'll
Yeah.
allow me,
Yeah.
is on the same day I got offered the job of being the chief executive of World Vision in New Zealand.
Yes.
And I got offered a very glamorous job in Oxford in the UK, heading up a very large health organization.
Hmm.
The health organization trebled my salary, came with all sorts of adjustments and status, and it was
Yes.
the world I knew. I'd been leading health organizations for a long time by then, and it brought prestige. World Vision brought downward mobility, more than half the salary. It
Yes.
meant moving to Auckland, which was the one part of the world we'd promised our kids we'd never move to the big city, and they were all on for this big adventure. And I was wrestling between these two visions of what the Lord might be calling me to. And I remembered a letter I wrote to myself as a 17-year-old when I left school
Right.
before I went to university. And I wrote this letter because I was alert to the fact that as a 17-year-old, I had all these ambitions to change the world, and a deep sense that was what the Lord was calling me to.
Yes.
But I looked at so many of my peers who by age 30, by age 40, and then at the impossible age of age 50, had basically just ended up being like everybody else.
Yes.
And I thought, I'm not going to be that person. And it was really interesting because I rediscovered that letter at the time I was wrestling with, if you like, the glamour
Yes.
and the prestige versus arguably the downward mobility
Yes.
of World Vision. And I made the call for World Vision because I recognized that my 12-year-old self, my 17-year-old self, would recognize myself in World Vision, maybe not in the glamour job. I have to tell you, Tommy, it was the very best decision I've ever made. For 8 years, I worked for World Vision, based in New Zealand, working all around the world. And it has truly been one of the most blessed, beautiful experiences of my life. It changed me as a Christian. It helped me understand the gospel in a whole new way. And I made some lifelong friends. It was very special indeed.
Wow. Just it's wonderful to see how the thread of God's guidance comes through the generations and through the decades of your life, Chris. You've mentioned on a couple of occasions Oxford and UK. I do know that you have an association with a well-renowned Ulsterman. So maybe you want to just mention that to those who are listening from this part of the universe.
So the well-regarded Ulsterman is John Lennox, who's a very dear friend, and in his very gracious way, kind of invited me into his world. So I was at Oxford University. I was doing a leadership program there, and John was speaking on it. And as so often happens, there's almost a codex between Christians. And I was sitting there thinking, he's using a very remarkable Christian worldview and Christian language in this academic setting. Anyway, I was responding in a similar kind of way. So we both at the end caught up and said, hey, we have to have a chat. And John, in his most delightful way, kind of brought me under his tutelage. And so as a consequence, I was invited back to Oxford to speak on the same program. And I did that for a number of years alongside John.
Wow.
He and I used to do a lot of programs together. And then I was speaking in my own right. And that friendship carried on into World Vision, where when I used to run leadership programs for World Vision with Oxford University, and John would be the principal presenter. And the framework was just so simple. It was actually taking major scriptural figures, Abraham, Daniel, and Joseph, and living with them for 3 or 4 days as we journeyed with them through Scripture, and then in the backdrop of Oxford, according with that really rich Christian tradition. So very moving and powerful. And I recall particularly working with a group of Middle Eastern leaders with John, and John was talking about the question of forgiveness and Joseph's forgiveness. Would he forgive his brothers? Now, in that room, we had Palestinians. In that room, we had Israelis. In that room, we had people who had come from Muslim contexts. You essentially had the melting pot of deep, deep levels of unforgiveness and regret. And just as John spoke into that situation, it was such a powerful move of the Holy Spirit. So, yes, very proud to call John a good friend, and enjoyed many, many good days with John.
Well, it's nice to know you have connections to good people from the right part of the world, Chris.
Indeed. And we have a rugby game coming up.
We don't want to talk about rugby right now. Ireland are a great team, but not such a good record against those guys from New Zealand, the All Blacks. So, Chris, inevitably, I look at a person's life, I look at my own life as having 3 distinct parts in many ways. Family life, our working life, and then our church and ministry life. Although you can't subdivide life, but in reality there are distinctives there. And I just wonder, firstly, maybe in family life, what wisdom do you think God has given you over, the years of family life that you've experienced?
It's such a good question, Tommy. The first thought comes to mind is that when I was a student at university and I'd met my wife, I realized then she's going to be my wife, but we were going out and
Yes.
we were listening at a big student conference, IFES or UCCF, the equivalent in New Zealand.
Yes.
And a woman was speaking from the Philippines, and she just got up there and talked about same bed, same dream. And it really spoke to both my wife and I, in the sense that if you're going to make a commitment to somebody for the rest of your life, and as we understand marriage to be a sacrament and to be a covenant, so it's not entered into lightly. The sense that before you share the same bed, you must have the same dream.
Wow.
And so for me, that's been a deep wisdom, because my wife and I have, we've traveled the world a lot. We've been in some really challenging contexts, at times some life-threatening contexts. There have been times of considerable doubt, trying to figure out what is happening and where is the Lord in this situation. I can't imagine that journey without somebody who had a similar dream to my own. And so that wisdom of same bed, same dream is advice that I'd give to anyone who is contemplating marriage or looking for a partner or something like that. That's the first piece. I guess the second advice is that we were lucky enough to have children. We've only raised boys, so these are comments about boys. And I do think it's different for girls from what I've seen with friends. I think it's also easier with boys. But I guess one of the lessons that we learned from that was there's a danger in being overly protective of your children. And I guess the explicit example is that when the World Vision opportunity came up, and with it the Oxford opportunity, it meant shifting our children at high school age. And all the advice was never shift your children at high school age. So
yes,
for those of you who use different terminology, it's that sort of age 12 through 17 years of age. And that's the time they need to be settled and stable. And we were going to be moving them during this time and wrestling with that question of what was the right thing to do. And I remember talking to a wonderful Christian leader here in New Zealand who said that he'd seen this happen so often, where Christian leaders failed to respond to the Lord's call on their life because they thought they were doing the right thing for their children. And he said, Chris, it will be tricky for your kids, but the Lord will look after them. Trust him. And I think that's been a lesson for us, because the Lord did look after our children.
Yes.
And both of them have said to us that, yes, it was terribly difficult to move at high school and to start all over again. But both have gone on to say it was the making of them as young men. So I think the second lesson for me is same bed, same dream. And secondly, in expressing our love, there's a danger in being overly protective. And instead, there's a real place for us in actually trusting the Lord, that he actually loves our children even more than we do ourselves. Lots more to say on that topic, but there's a couple of things to at least start the conversation.
Both are deeply profound, I have to say, Chris. Same bed, same dream. And that last comment, that the Lord loves our children even more than we do. Wow, what a piece of revelation for many. Because so often we are very protective of our children, but just that thought that the Lord loves our children more than we do is a very precious thought. So thank you for sharing that. So then we'll move on to the wisdom that you have gained from workplace leadership. And you've led in many different contexts in many nations, Chris. So what is the key points of wisdom you might wish to share?
Tommy, you might have to stop me here, because this is a subject that I think about a lot, and I wrestle with a lot, to be honest. But let me start. When I look back on my leadership journey, which is still forming, though I have to say my leadership journey, I'm at this stage of moving probably from a player to a coach. And that's a hard transition, if I'm honest with you, because I still think I've got one more big game in me, one more big play, and just one more season, Lord. But I've also seen so many sports stars who played one season too long.
Yeah.
And I sense that, my journey is increasingly towards being a coach and coaching others on that journey. So that's the context in which I'm currently operating in. But at a deeper level, I think my journey has been from leading to being led. So when I first became a chief executive, I was a chief executive at age 39. It's quite young at the time, running a very big health organization. And I was Christian and all that kind of stuff. But I was very much thought I was the leader.
Yeah.
And the Lord was blessing it and all that kind of stuff. But actually, as I've experienced leadership more and more, I realized that no. The journey of the leader is to actually being led and being led by God in this extraordinary journey where the emphasis is less on what you actually do and increasingly on what you're becoming and what you actually bring, the character that you bring to leadership more than any other skill set that you might bring. And where that takes me to is that when I look at on my career, there's been moments of success, but also using that terminology, quite a few moments of failure. So in my case, I've had two situations where a board have said to me at the end of quite long tenure, we've kind of had enough. We want a new face. And grappling with that and trying to think through what does that mean?
Yeah.
And realizing that if we use success failure terms, we will never fully understand leadership. That actually what sits behind this is we're just called to be faithful.
Yeah.
And sometimes faithfulness will bring success with it, but quite often it won't. At most will be a footnote in history. And that was the way it was always designed to be. So that's some immediate reflections on leadership. But if I can add one more,
Yes.
Tommy, it is I've wrestled a lot with the temptations of leadership. And Eugene Peterson, in this extraordinary book, I just love reading it. It's called Under the Unpredictable Plant. And in it, he's talking about the leader of the journey. And he talks about, particularly for pastoral leaders, that we set out with the aim to talk about God.
Yeah.
But and then we start to become like God. And then we presume that we're God. And he says, woe betide anyone who's called to be a leader. But for those who are called to leadership, be ready. And there's a sense in which there are some temptations of leadership, which I think are very, very real. And I think that the temptations I've faced are exactly the same temptations that Jesus faced in the wilderness. Isn't it interesting how he's baptized, the Holy Spirit appears, God speaks, it's pretty dramatic. And then he's led by the Holy Spirit into the desert.
Yes.
And those temptations, I think, were the temptations of leadership because they preceded his public ministry. And what were those temptations? Well, the way I understand them, and they've been the temptations that I've felt, is first and foremost the temptation to be the miracle worker.
Yeah.
And believe me, when you work for World Vision, the temptation to be the miracle worker is very real. It's kind of all set up for you to appear and, bless people and be this remarkable hero. And realizing actually, no. That's a temptation. And then the second temptation is to presume on God.
Yes.
And then the third temptation is, in fact, to play God. And I realized that in my Christian life, I've confronted each of those temptations. And it's only as I've wrestled with those temptations that in one sense, I think I've started to understand what leadership truly is like.
Wow. I almost want to hit pause and come back and do another podcast with Chris Clarke on the temptations of a leader. Such depth there, Chris. Thank you. You've been involved in churches all your life, Chris, from a child. You've been involved with Christian ministries, and we've mentioned World Vision. We've mentioned your father-in-law's background in Youth for Christ. We've not yet even mentioned our leadership, which is where you and I first connected. A ministry birthed again from the wider Billy Graham family. And so you've been connected with ministry in the local church and the global church for the vast majority of your life. So it seems unfair to ask you in a few moments, but in a few moments, could you maybe share a couple of key points of wisdom from that experience?
So let me talk about the church gathered,
Yes,
and then the church scattered. So first of all, the church gathered. one of the other roles I play is I'm chief executive of what's called the Wilberforce Foundation here in New Zealand, which supports about 100 faith-based charities, for-purpose organisations across Aotearoa, New Zealand. We did some research about 3 years ago looking at faith and belief among New Zealanders. And we weren't just talking to Christians. It was a proper academic study. So people from all different backgrounds.
Yes.
The results were challenging. They're not out of line with what you'd probably see in Ireland or most Western European countries. What came through very clearly was that New Zealanders still have a deep respect for Christ and for Jesus and for his story. But they have a profound and deep, not just disrespect, but concern for the church, for the institution. And when we inquired into that dissonance between, if you like, the founder and his representation on earth, what came through was, again, not surprisingly, but it was the strength of the feeling. It was that our posture was all wrong and our positions were all wrong. So our posture came across as divisive, as harsh, as judgmental. And they drew a real contrast between that and their understanding of who Jesus was. And then in terms of our positions, that we were critiqued on a number of issues where we seemed to particularly focus on the privatization of religion rather than the big public issues of religion.
Yes.
And so we were strongly critiqued there. So the challenge, I think, for the church, at least in a New Zealand context, is we need to reclaim our posture. And this is the thing that really strikes me about Jesus, is he had a consummate posture. This didn't mean that he didn't have a position, but often meant that he led with a posture before he came in with a position. And of course, if you're to have a posture, you have to have a stance. You have to have a position.
Yes.
But I think there's a lesson for us in largely secular context about a posture which is winsome, a posture which is listening, a posture which is concerned about the real issues that concern my country, New Zealanders, and not necessarily my issues. That gets us the opportunity to have an audience. But underneath that, it seems to me, as a church, we need to listen deeply. So for me, the big challenge in the church in New Zealand, the church gathered, is less about our position on certain matters of theology, such as the atonement and so on, but much more about the posture and how we engage with the world. And John Stott talks about double listening, how we listen to Scripture and we listen to the world. And that seems to be the kind of posture for that we're all grappling with them, certainly in New Zealand. To the question of the church scattered, I have to say, Tommy, I thank the Lord that I didn't end up working for the church. when I was younger, and when the Lord spoke to me, I just assumed I'd become a missionary or I'd work for a church. That was kind of what it was. So that classic sacred secular divide. I'm so delighted that hasn't actually been my journey as a professional Christian.
Yeah.
And much of my professional life has been in the marketplace. But in terms of church scattered, I think the challenge for the church here is about we need to get out of the salt shaker. So much of our church life is focused on the church gathered and aggregating the salt rather than actually spreading the salt. And the extent to which we actually equip our Christian leaders for ministry in business, in government, in media, across all the major forums. And this is, of course, where organizations like Arrow play such a critical part, because what we're trying to do is equip leaders wherever they are placed to lead more like Jesus, to lead more to Jesus, and to be led more by Jesus. I think that for us is the challenge that confronts the church so powerfully at the moment. And if I might add a last one, partly because I lead an organization called Wilberforce, I spent a huge amount of time in the story of Wilberforce and people like Clarkson who gathered around him and Dean and others. They seem to me to have a very good understanding of mission and the mission of the church. And Chris Wright, I think, has picked this up beautifully, where he talks about mission in terms of 5 elements. And I think this is perhaps the big challenge facing the church. So there is the traditional mission that you might understand, and I understand, which is about evangelism. It's about proclamation, telling the gospel. That second aspect around discipleship, around teaching. And then the third element, which I think we all subscribe to, which is the call to care for others, the tending of others. But there's 2 other critical parts of mission, which often are neglected, but are right at the core of Scripture. One is the treasuring of creation, that actually we are given responsibility to treasure creation as stewards of creation. but we are notably absent as a church, largely from the big debates that are going on about climate and so on. And then the last one is around the transformation of unjust systems and structures. And this is the connection to Wilberforce. Is this deeply passionate evangelist who committed his life to the reformation of manners and to the abolition of the slave trade.
Absolutely.
And so for me, if we could reclaim that sense of the full mission of God, then we might truly become the church that God needs in this world at this moment.
Wonderful, Chris. A couple of years back, I did some work with the Anglican Church in Ireland around the 5 marks of mission, and based exactly on the 5 marks that you have just mentioned. And I think right now, in the timeline of where we are, the world is struggling with lots of issues around creation and around climate change. And I think many Christians are still struggling to find their posture in that debate. And it's important that we do find the right posture. And so thank you for your reflections. I want to take you right back, however, Chris, to a young Chris Clarke who was on the 4th floor of a building in a university, and a young lady stumbles out of the lift. But that young man, who I suspect was maybe early 20s at most at that stage, or around about that, what 3 things would you tell that young man if you met him today? What 3 pieces of wisdom would you tell that Chris Clarke if you could go back in time?
Do you know what immediately comes to mind? We talked earlier about my father-in-law who passed away 3 weeks ago.
Yeah.
Peter Spoelstra was 92, and he was passionate for the gospel. He was Caleb to Joshua, or Timothy to Paul, always behind the scenes, but unbelievably supportive of Christian ministry.
Yes.
And just before he died, he said to me, Chris, at my funeral, I don't care what happens, I just want you to preach the gospel. And it caused me to think in terms of preach the gospel. What does that mean? You know, what would I say?
Yes.
And in fact, as I was thinking about what I'd say, I was thinking about my younger self, mainly because there were a lot of young people who were there, because so much of Peter's ministry had been with young people.
Yes.
And so I think the first thing I'd say to myself is just some very simple statements. That the first and foremost is that God is for us, and that really, really matters. He is so for us. And then speaking to my 20-year-old self, it is that God has got my back. You know,
Amen.
He's never going to abandon me. He's never going to strand me. He is always there for me. And that's perhaps the third point, that God will never let me go. Now, as a 20-year-old, I was exploring theology and all these things and absolutely loving it. But actually, I needed to be brought back to the absolute core of the gospel, which is that God is for us. He's got my back, and He'll never let me go, even though at times I let Him go. You know, He's never going to let me go. I think that's the one piece of advice that I would give to my 20-year-old self. If I gave 2 other pieces of advice, the second one is, I think, to speak into the question of vocation. I think the question that every young person and older person asks is, you know, what I want to do with the rest of my life. And if we're Christians, that has an extra meaning to it. I think I'd want to spend some time talking about what is vocation all about. I saw it in a very binary term. I saw it in terms of what was I called to do.
Yes.
And I guess it's only in more recent years that I realized that vocation is much richer than that. It's actually less about what I'm called to do. That's context. But actually, all of us are called, first and foremost, to be in Christ. And secondly, to be in community, in family or in a church family or whatever it is. And then only thirdly, in discharged in a particular context, I put all the emphasis and all the energy on the context.
Yes.
Was I called to be a lawyer? Was I called to be a doctor? Was I called to do this, or was I called to that? Actually, that's not the way to think about vocation. Because one thing I've learned is that the context changes a lot, and often it's through no fault of your own.
Yes.
So does that therefore mean that your call has changed? No. My call always was to be a bearer of Christ in whatever context I was. I think if I could have sat down with my 20-year-old self and had that conversation, I'd have saved myself a whole lot of angst.
Wow, great advice.
And then finally, Tommy, it would be this, that the dreams that you have as a 8-year-old, a 12-year-old, a 20-year-old, they will be broken, and allow God to break your dreams. we're often encouraged to pursue our dreams, in contemporary song and contemporary stories and so on. And I guess the great example of that was Martin Luther King, who spoke about, I have a dream.
Yes.
But actually, he preached another sermon. He preached another sermon 5 years earlier called Shattered Dreams. And in that one, he talked about the fact that Paul always had the ambition to go to Spain. He never got to Spain. He always wanted to go to Spain. And that actually the life of the Christian will involve dreams that are shattered. And that's okay. But it's out of the shattering of our dreams, which are often driven by our own ego and our own ambition and all these kind of things, that God, if we're attentive to him, plants an even more significant dream. Now, it may not bring the fame and the attention, the adulation that our first dream might have had. But in terms of faithfulness, that's the dream that God is calling us to become. And so for me, three things I'd say to my 20-year-old self. I'd preach the gospel.
Yes.
And I want to leave my 20-year-old self absolutely convinced that there's absolutely no way that God will abandon me.
Yes.
He is for me and he's got my back. Secondly, that my call is actually first and foremost to be a follower of Christ, to be in community. And then lastly, to express it in a certain context or a certain profession. And then lastly, the sense that allow God to break your dreams, because an even bigger dream will form if you allow him to do that work in your life.
Wonderful, Chris. So good. We want to thank you for what might be the first of a podcast with Chris Clarke. There might be a repeat where we go deeper in the future, particularly around some of the issues you've raised today. That whole thought process around shattered dreams, and it's just such a wonderful thing to delve into and explore. But as we finish today, folks, I want to just be saying that remember, God is for you. God has got your back, and God will never let you go. Chris Clarke, thank you very much for being with us today. We hope to catch you again soon. Blessings, folks.
Thank you, Tommy. God bless.
Bye.